Môre meneere, dame. My son recently turned 13, so I consider it an incredible privilege when people still want to listen to me. I don't have a lot of that at home with a teenage son anymore. So baie dankie Ferry, dankie vir die uitnodiging. Okay, for the larger part of the presentation, I'll be doing it in English, as I do parts of this presentation elsewhere as well, then it's predominantly in English. So if you forgive me for not going with the Afrikaans language, I'm going to predominantly go with English. Thank you to the alumni for this opportunity. Edith, thank you very much for your support and initiative behind this as well. I've been asked to talk about flexible business models as a sort of a reaction or a way to deal with the complexity in terms of the challenges that we have in the 21st century. And let me say right from the outset that insofar as flexibility is concerned and the need for organizations to be flexible, there's nothing really new in that. Organizations for decades have always been challenged with having to be flexible. The difference is, however, as we're experiencing things these days, is that the need to change is not just based on the need, but also on the speed. And that's what organizations are struggling with tremendously. And in essence, Ferdy referred to my book, thank you for that. The idea is not that I do a book promotion, but wherever I go, I take it along. A lot of the research that I've done for my PhD is written up in the book. The book is just more of a commercial form. I'm sure none of you want to go and actually take a thesis off the shelf, but a book makes one easier read. So I'll be referring to the book just merely in terms of the research that we've conducted. So when I say that research has shown, then please realize that that is the research that we've done over a 7-year period, along with the business school, looking at a total of 121 organizations, both locally and internationally, to come up with this body of knowledge. So what will we be discussing? We'll critically evaluate the relevance and the applicability of what we call mechanistic and non-systemic management approaches to sound strategic management challenges in the 21st century. Now, normally when I've taken such a big bite in terms of a topic, I like to just chop it up into smaller chunks so that everybody is actually comfortable with what it is that we're going to be talking about. So I've identified 4 themes in this topic. The first one being the critical analysis and the critical evaluation. The second one being that so-called mechanistic and non-systemic business approach. Then the third one being strategic management or sound strategic management. And the fourth one being a 21st century business environment. So let's go to the first theme just for purposes of explaining or unpacking the topic. In essence, what we find is organizations use tried and tested methodologies when they scan the environment. So typically they go to key feature identification. If you, for instance, conduct a pestle analysis, organizations normally go, politics consists out of this, so they list those key items underneath politics. And what we're asking or recommending in terms of a better way to deal with the challenges and the dynamism in the environment is that you start to engage on a higher level with those systems as opposed to just doing key feature identification. It's quoted very nicely there where it says that the better we can understand the cause and effect associations between the things shaping our business and our markets, the better placed we are in terms of making strategic decisions. So it very much deals on a level of understanding and not so much what we know. Most organizations, when we talk to them, know that the environment is dynamic and they know there's changes, but the question is, do they really understand it? So we're moving beyond pestle and start to embrace a systems thinking approach as opposed to a mechanistic approach to things. Second little bite from that huge chunk is explaining mechanistic. It's probably best explained by comparing it to its opposite. So when we talk mechanistic, we typically say organizations would take the environment and they, through a reductionist approach, would break the environment into smaller little manageable bits. They'll segment it and they'll categorize it. And most of you might be familiar with it, either through your work or through other academic or business material. Pestle is a way of categorizing and segmenting the environment. So we break it into smaller manageable bits. Morning. Okay, so the opposite of that would be not to look at the smaller broken down bits and pieces, but to rather look at the interrelatedness and interdependencies between those pieces to get a better understanding of the holistic picture. So it's not that we're doing away with mechanistic, we're sort of building onto mechanistic. I'll still break it into smaller manageable bits, but I won't just look at that, I'll also look at those linkages between those bits. I've taken the motivation of that from my promoter, Professor de Kooning at Stellenbosch main campus, who states that by now most of us have become accustomed to the 21st business strategic challenges within which non-systemic and mechanistic approaches are seemingly failing, providing us with the challenges that we are currently experiencing worldwide. Third little piece of the large chunk, sound strategic management. Again, easiest explained by saying what it's not. It's not just a plan. It's more a plan that needs to be implemented. It's actually measured and evaluated in terms of being implemented, operationalized, as I say there. It needs to remain competitive and sustainable, and it needs to stay current and appropriate. Now, difference between current and appropriate, probably best explained if you look at what happened to BlackBerry. BlackBerry went current, went for blue ocean market, so went for the next generation, which is seemingly the right thing to do, but in the appropriate, in that aspect, or at the same time, not being appropriate, i.e. ignoring its existing market segment, which is your executive businessman. So with all the teenagers all of a sudden having BlackBerries, clogging up bandwidth, and now I'm constantly out of signal. So it's very much a combination of staying current and appropriate at the same time. And then the last little piece of that big chunk would be the 21st business century. Now, this is probably the main phenomenon that places the requirements and the pressures on organizations to remain flexible. And that is that we're dealing with this dynamic environment. And the significant change is, as I state there, that the pace of change is surpassing our ability to adapt. The fact that the environment's changing is nothing new. It always used to change, but it was as if it was changing slower. Companies could sit down once a year, plan strategically, forecast for the next year, and up to a large extent, more or less, be in line with that forecast or be accurate with that forecast. Now that leads to what we call temporal spaces of displacement. Big word, all it means is your thinking is stuck in the past. So organizations are so used to, for such a long time, dealing with an environment where they are ahead of the change, that when they now currently plan, they battle to deal with the fact that change is actually now superseding their ability to keep up with that change. So when they think in terms of business models and in terms of strategy, even though it's 2013, they'll still apply thinking of 1995 as an example. So that's what we mean by temporal spaces of displacement. It's as if, yes, the time has moved on, organizations has moved on, but when it comes to strategic thinking, we're stuck with what we've become used to in terms of strategic management, and I'll talk more about that. One of the things, for instance, if you take something like structure follows strategy. Structure follows strategy would be a temporal space. For a very long time, that's how we were thinking. Now we're saying, well, it doesn't, or does it? And if it doesn't, what's the alternative? How can structure not follow strategy? And how do I overcome that assumption that for so many years have been underpinning the way in which business operates? And that's the challenge that we're facing. Okay, so topic, those four main components: evaluating mechanistic, what that is, looking at the 21st century business environment, and then specifically looking at sound strategic management. A little bit of academia for yourself, purpose of today. I'm trying to give you better ways of looking at the 21st century. I'm not just going to talk academics here. I stand with my one foot there, but my other foot's very much a practicing consultant, so I'm going to try and give you practical tools that you can take away and that you can actually apply in your own organization. Hopefully we'll come up and you will be comfortable with looking at a different way in terms of scanning, which then feeds your flexibility as we try to marry strategy and structure and not keep it so sequential as what the nature of that relationship is currently. Okay, so two main things that I'm going to be looking at: environment and then organizational structure, with some tools in between to get those two to marry. The way in which I work is something that I've learned from the work from Drucker. Never had the privilege and opportunity to meet him, but in essence what he did is he would go into organizations and he would question the underpinning assumptions in those organizations. And the first assumption that I want to question here is, we have an assumption that current conceptualized scanning frameworks are appropriate conceptualizations of the 21st century environment. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, if we draw a picture on the wall that depicts or represents the environment, our assumption is that our picture is correct and it's actually a correct interpretation of the business environment. Now, coupled with that, we then assume that our current levels of strategic dialogues, behavior, and thinking is appropriate. And that's what we're questioning. All right. Now, in talking about, or in trying to question this assumption, let's talk a little bit about the environment. We already said it's very volatile, it's random, it's radical, it changes all the time, and it's exponentially a lot more change in terms of intensity and pace of change. Already alluded to what Professor de Kooning said, that we're all familiar with the challenges that we're facing. Our problem, however, is that your regular and your standard, what we have become to mechanistic and non-systemic business approaches, are seemingly failing. Now, why are we saying that? Well, you have something like skill shortages and unemployment on having their own tug of war on two sides of what seems to be a counterindicative scale. You have China slowing down. You have Greece, Portugal, I can carry on with the European countries not getting out of the economic doldrums. You have a global economic system that seemingly can't get out of the recession that we're in at the moment. In South Africa alone, we haven't been achieving our economic forecasts and growth figures now for a number of consecutive terms already. I just have some statistics on 2011. Lost over R1 billion in wages due to work stoppages. Lost 208 working days for every 1,000 employees in the country. And so the list carries on. So undoubtedly, the way in which we're trying to deal with this crisis at the moment isn't working. So that's where we're coming in and we're saying, well, let's look at how we're thinking at the moment. And maybe if we change our thinking, we can come up with better solutions. So that's the question. What would be the correct manner in which to deal with the strategic challenge? And the challenge that we refer to here is that seemingly our current ways of strategic thinking, which determines our strategic behavior and our strategic dialogue, is not enough. It's not adequate. It's not helping us. It's not solving the problem. Idea might be to come up with something new, but more than just something new, maybe something distinctly different. Rewriting the textbooks, looking at the Porter's fire forces, looking at the pestles, looking at current conceptualizations of the environment and asking whether we shouldn't be changing this. Remember, your picture of the environment is the starting point of how you're going to think about the environment. So that if that is fundamentally flawed, you're never going to come out of the blocks in terms of dealing with the challenge that we have today. Part of the reason for that is that the complexity we're dealing with is not the sum of smaller bits. So to merely reduce it into smaller bits to try and get a grip on it and understand it better isn't necessarily helping us. Rather, we need to look at the interplay of the interrelatedness and interdependencies between systems. So they're much closer to one another. Politics, customer, labor, public pressure groups, and the likes. They're much closer to one another. They're not so segmented and apart as what we normally draw them. And the idea would be to deal with that interrelatedness and interdependency between them. And come up in the process with what is one term I'm very envious of my promoter. He came up with this term, talking about an optimal floating equilibrium, and it so beautifully describes exactly what we should be doing, where the organization gets a lot closer to the environment, and as the environment changes along with the environment. In the process, of course, the challenge is to unlearn this so-called mechanistic way of doing things and thinking, and at the same time learn new, more appropriate levels of strategic thinking. So the idea would be to look at current scanning conceptualizations. This is a generic one that I selected. Most of us are familiar with this. And then bearing in mind that that sort of framework also guides your scanning process, your scanning methodology, the way in which you're going to scan. And the idea would be to antagonize that standard way of conceptualizing the environment, pull it apart a little bit. Why is that so important? There's a very strong positive correlation between scanning, environmental scanning, and business performance.